and a very warm welcome back to City Breaks. I won't be saying hello in any foreign tongue this time, because this brand new series is actually set in England. I'm Marion Jones, and this is the introductory episode to City Breaks Stratford-on-Avon. Yes, I know Stratford-on-Avon isn't actually a city, but bear with me. It is very much a little town which punches way above its weight, which is extremely popular with tourists, both British and foreign, because, of course, it is both Shakespeare's birthplace and the place where he's buried. And so I just decided that between larger series, we're going to have a mini-series, 3 episodes in total, dedicated to Stratford-on-Avon. Although the series is small but perfectly formed, I'm going to follow the usual format for this introductory episode, so a little bit of geography and history to set everything in context, followed by a section on what Stratford was like in Shakespeare's day, and a suggested walk around the town centre, which will take you past all the main sites. We won't really be going in, I'm saving the detail for the second and third episodes, but we'll have a wander past and just give a rundown of what the main things to visit are. Okay, let's get going. Regarding getting your bearings, we're very much in Middle England, about 20 miles south of Birmingham, 85 miles or so northwest of London. That was a 3 or 4 day walk in Shakespeare's day. A town without its Shakespeare connections and industry would be a small English market town, having a population of just over 30,000 people. Its name's quite interesting, made up of 3 different words. Strat, which is the Old English for street, a bit like the Dutch and the German and whatnot. Ford, which meant a place where you could cross the river. And Avon, which comes from the Old English word for river. So this little settlement grew up as a place where a street crossed the river. The very oldest part of the town is the bit where Holy Trinity Church is, and the grid pattern of medieval streets not too far from it form then the rest of the old town. 8 or 10 little streets with names like Sheep Street and Rother Street, Rother being an old-fashioned word for cattle, or in other cases road names that told you what happened in that street, for example Chapel Lane or Bridge Street. A major geographical feature is the River Avon, which flows down the eastern side of the town, the bit where the Royal Shakespeare Theatre is sited, the part where you can expect to see swans and people going on boat rides, and a couple of well-known statues which I'll come back to, the Gower Memorial and the Swan Fountain. 2 interesting possibilities for edging just a little way out of Stratford. If you take the footpath to the west, about a mile, it will take you to Shottery, which is where Anne Hathaway's cottage is. And if you follow the towpath along the Stratford-on-Avon Canal, about 3.5 miles, you'll come to Wilmcote, another little village. This one was the home of Mary Arden, so Shakespeare's mother. If you go out there today, then you arrive at Mary Arden's farm, a working Tudor farm, sort of farm-stroke-museum really, run by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. As for history, the very first thing built here was a monastery, roughly on the site of where the Holy Trinity Church is today, and a settlement grew up around it. By the 12th century it had become a little town, and was granted a market licence. It was all governed by guilds, for example the Guild of the Holy Cross, connected to the monastery. A hospice was built on the site of today's almshouses. There's also the Guild Chapel and the Guild Hall. Big changes, however, in the 16th century because of the Reformation. In 1547, Edward VI made all church assets crown property, which meant that places which had belonged to the church now became borough amenities. The Guildhall, for example, became the meeting place for the borough council. In Shakespeare's day, he was born in 1564, it was already a thriving little town, although very much not without its problems. Shakespeare was born in April, and in July that same year, so an entry in the church registry tells us, the plague arrived in Stratford. Not for the first time, not for the last time either, but a serious outbreak in which 230 people died. That was 1/8 of the population. Also in Shakespeare's time, 3 massive fires in 1594, 95 and 1614. The first one destroyed Wood Street and part of Chapel Street. The second one took out a whole block between Sheep Street, High Street and Bridge Street. And in the third one, 54 houses were burnt down, plus other properties, so stables, grain stores. Lots and lots of those wattle and daub built houses with thatched roofs. But not New Place, Shakespeare's residence, because that was much more modern and built of brick and tiles. Leap forward to the early 19th century, Stratford became much more industrial. One factor was the Stratford Canal, built in 1815, which increased commercial traffic and led to the building of 2 canal basins in the area now known as the Bancroft Gardens, lined by wharves and warehouses. Then there was a new phase in 1859 because the Great Western Railway came to Stratford, and the warehouses moved gradually out towards that and away from the riverside. There is one reminder in Cox's Yard, which is now a riverside pub, but used to be an industrial yard. The beginnings of what you might call Stratford as we know it today started in the 1860s, 1864 to be precise, which was the tercentenary of Shakespeare's birth, and which the townspeople decided to celebrate in style. And one of the things they did was to plan a new theatre to be called the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. So really the first time when the works of Shakespeare could be performed to large indoor audiences in his hometown. About 10 years after that, the Gower Memorial was installed, a big sculpture down in Bancroft Gardens of the man himself, surrounded by figures from his plays. And the main things to mention from the 20th century would be the fact that in 1926, the beautiful Shakespeare Memorial Theatre burnt down, was rebuilt, a new one was opened in 1932, renamed the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in 1961, just as the Royal Shakespeare Company had been founded, and bringing things right up to date, 2010 was the date when the very much renovated, refurbished, in part newly built Royal Shakespeare Theatre opened. That, of course, is the one that you can tour or go and watch performances in today. Just before we leave the history, I thought I'd mention 2 men who are very important personalities in the story of Stratford. The first one is Hugh Clopton, born in 1440, in the village of Clopton, just near Stratford. He was a second son, so he wasn't going to inherit anything, and he set off to London to seek his fortune, which he very much did, ending up as a member of the Company of Mercers, ending up as sheriff and then mayor of London. He built a new place, the house which Shakespeare eventually lived in, but his main legacy was the replacement of the old timber bridge with a stone one which you can still see there today. I think it's actually called Clopton Bridge. He is a 16th century historian explaining why this was so important. Quote, "Before the time of Sir Hugh Clopton, there was but a poor bridge of timber, and no causeway to come up to it, whereby many poor folks either refused to come to Stratford when the river was up, or, coming thither, stood in jeopardy of life." Clopton wasn't married, and when he died, he left most of his money to Stratford to pay for additions to Holy Trinity Church, to have the Guild Chapel rebuilt, and for the upkeep of the poor. And the second well-known person is referred to in some history books as Stratford's most eminent Victorian, one Edward Flower, born in 1805. He was a businessman. He built a brewery in Stratford in 1831, taking advantage of the canal, siting it there so that all his products could be shipped away easily and quickly. It was soon a flourishing business, Flower and Sons. Punch magazine described what they brewed as, quote, "about the best beer brewed in England." Edward Flower exported a lot of his beer to India, pale ale I think it was called, very popular over there apparently, and he also had the excellent idea of opening a Tide pub, the very first one in England, so a pub which was expressly there in order to serve the beer that he and his colleagues brewed. Such a good idea that he opened several more, and lots of other brewing companies began to do the same. Apart from all his business interests, Edward Flower was 4 times Mayor of Stratford, and the reason he's so important to the town even today is that because he was so wealthy, he was a major benefactor and left something highly important in Stratford. because it was largely his money which paid for the building of the first Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, the one which was unfortunately destroyed by fire in 1926, but which was and is the forerunner of today's Royal Shakespeare Theatre. Let's have a quick look back at Stratford in Shakespeare's day. It was then a town of about 2,000 people. Today's population is more like just over 30,000. There were about 220 houses and some 200 families living there. 70% of the men and 90% of the women were illiterate. And for an idea of the lives they led and the sort of things they got up to, I've chosen 3 very short quotations from Peter Ackroyd's book, Shakespeare, the Biography. The first one gives an idea of the sort of ways that people in Shakespeare's day earned their living. Quote, "A survey of occupations from 1570 to 1630 shows that the town had 23 butchers, 20 weavers, 16 shoemakers, 15 bakers, and 15 carpenters." But, as Peter Ackroyd goes on to explain, it was not so much the case in those days that people had one primary occupation. Often they did a range of different things, which all combined to help them make the money they needed to survive. He cites as an example John Shakespeare, Sir William Shakespeare's father, writing that, quote, "His principal occupation was that of glover, one of 23 in the town, but he also earned his living as a trader in wool, a moneylender, and a maker of malt. The brewing and selling of ale was a speciality in Stratford. No fewer than 67 households were involved in that trade." I imagine that perhaps Stratford's growing reputation for beer and brewing was what lay behind the decision of Edward Flowers to come and settle in Stratford. He wasn't born there, he chose to live there. Perhaps that's why. And thirdly, Peter Ackroyd outlines the idea of Stratford being a very small and rather rural community, surrounded by farms and countryside, a place where people's lives were very much tied up with the rhythms of the agricultural year, which, as he describes it, go from, quote, "the February sowing and harrowing, the March pruning, the June haymaking, the reaping of August, the threshing of September, and the pig-killing of November. There were horses and sheep and pigs and cattle and bees. There was tillage land and fallow land, meadow and pasture." And, as everywhere else in England in those days, the rhythms of the year were also tied to the church year, to church holidays, Christmas and Easter and feast days and Lent. And St. George's Day, April the 23rd, which of course is taken as Shakespeare's birthday and also as the day on which he died. And I found a description of the St. George's Day celebrations in Stratford when a saint rode through the town on horseback, that is to say, a man dressed up in armour and leading a dragon which blew out flames and smoke, and followed by what I read as being, quote, "buffoons in costume and warriors armed with poles." It was by no means all jollity. I also read descriptions of quite violent scenes in the town involving the drawing of daggers or something known as making a fray, which I think might mean picking a fight in English, and an explanation that certain men of good character were charged to be constables who had to keep order. If, in fact, you'd like to know a lot more about the Tudor life in Stratford, help is at hand, because in Sheep Street is a museum called Tudor World, who makes it its mission to describe Tudor life and the history of Stratford. It's one of those very hands-on places where you can dress up and watch demonstrations and try things out. A good place, actually, to take children particularly. And just before we leave Shakespeare's Stratford, I would like to add that as far as I'm aware, Stratford does not appear at all ever in any one of his plays, although you can find all sorts of details that he surely must have learnt in Stratford. Things about different trades and agricultural practices, references to flowers and woods and crops that he must have got to know in the surrounding area. And I imagine lots of those rough and ready groups that you meet in so many of his plays are very possibly based, or some of them at least, on people that Shakespeare will have known really well in 16th century Stratford. So, to round off the episode, I thought I might go on an imaginary saunter through the centre of the town. Just a brief overview really, an introduction to lots of places that you might want to come back to, and which I will be dealing with in a lot more detail. So the places connected to Shakespeare himself and the life he lived in Stratford, the birthplace, Anne Hathaway's cottage, and a number of others I'll be dealing with in the next episode. And then episode 3 is going to be all about theatre in Stratford, so that'll be a good excuse to go round the Royal Shakespeare Theatre and other theatres and other buildings connected to them. But for our brief introductory walk, I think we should start outside the Royal Shakespeare Theatre itself, and then take a walk along the road behind it, which is called Waterside, one of the places, incidentally, where you can hire a boat. You'll probably pass some tied up. There's one collection I remember where they were all named after female Shakespeare characters, so they had names like Portia and Cressida. Opposite that, you pass Stratford's best-known pub, the Dirty Duck, on your right-hand side. It's a Grade 2 listed building, dates from 1738. It used to be called the Black Swan, but it was renamed by American troops stationed here in World War II, and it has quite a reputation as a place where people from the theatre like to repair when they finish their work. In fact, if you go in through the main entrance and turn immediately right, you come into a little bar labelled the Actors' Bar, and inside you will find loads and loads of photographs of famous actors who've all passed through. You'll see Laurence Olivier and Judi Dench, Helen Mirren and Ian McKellen, and hosts more. If you happen to be passing in opening hours, then I would very much recommend that you pop in for a drink. Continuing down the road, you will also pass, also on your right, somewhere called The Other Place, which is another Royal Shakespeare Theatre venue, and one I'll talk more about in episode 3. Further on, you will then come to Holy Trinity Church, the oldest surviving building in Stratford. Much of it was there before Shakespeare was born, so the earliest parts date from the 13th century. The nave and the aisles were built in the 14th century, for example. The tower, though, was added after Shakespeare's day, but it is the place where he was baptised and also where he is buried, where you can read the words he chose to have on his gravestone and where you can see a sculpture of him, done by a contemporary, so very possibly quite a good likeness. When you come out of the church, if you go along a road called Old Town, you will pass somewhere called Hall's Croft, which is a 16th, 17th century house which was lived in at one point by John Hall, Shakespeare's son-in-law, and his daughter Susanna. It's closed at the time of recording, but I think the plans are eventually to reopen it as a museum, possibly one relating to medicine in the period, because John Hall was a doctor. If you turn right into Church Street, you will then pass some old almshouses built in the 15th century by the Guild of the Holy Cross. So these were houses built especially for charity, places where they could put the poor up, people who were homeless. And you will also pass the Guildhall and Shakespeare's Schoolroom, a magnificent half-timbered building with a very shiny black, white and gold logo of Shakespeare on its signage. And again, I'll come back to both those places, but just briefly, the Guildhall was originally a hospital linked to the monastery, and parts of its chapel and the frescoes on the wall are still there. But then it became the town council building from after the Reformation. So also on the ground floor you will find the counting room, which contains a large lockable wooden chest where they used to store important council documents and silver plate to use for their ceremonies. And upstairs in the same building, the schoolroom. Yes, actually the room where Shakespeare almost certainly went to school. I don't think it's written in black and white anywhere that he did, but it's just assumed that somebody who ended up with the education he obviously had had must have been to school, even though many children of his age wouldn't have done. And surely he went to the local school here in Stratford. So you can climb up and see the 2 rooms with the wooden benches that the children sat on, and in the second room desks set up with inkwells and quills and lots of information about the school day in Shakespeare's time, and actually quite often actors playing the role of the teacher and demonstrating for you what perhaps it was like to be a schoolchild in Shakespeare's day. Just past the Guildhall and the schoolroom comes the Guild Chapel, where Shakespeare will certainly have attended prayers on school days, and whose bell will have tolled when he died. Before the Reformation, that is, before Shakespeare's day, the walls were covered with colourful frescoes, which were then painted over, although some have been uncovered again. You can, for instance, at the end of the church, see what's left of the portrayal of the Day of Judgment. Before you leave the area, if you just look down Chapel Lane, you will see the signs to King Edward's Grammar School, the school opened by Edward VI and attended by Shakespeare, although you're looking now at the much newer buildings, which are the grammar school as it is today. Carry on your walk towards the town centre, go straight ahead into Chapel Street, and you will pass on your right New Place, which was once one of the town's most impressive houses, so the one built by Hugh Clopton in the 1490s and bought by Shakespeare himself about a century after that. The house where he lived then for the last few years of his life and where he died. Unfortunately, it is no longer there. That is to say, the building has gone, but it's been replaced by another which has information boards in it to tell you all about it, and a lovely garden set out as it almost certainly would have been in Shakespeare's day. Another place I'll be coming back to in the next episode. Carrying on for the moment, if you turn left into Ely Street, then right into Rother Street, you will go past something marked on your map as the Bear Pit, which sounds very Shakespearean because of course there were bear pits and bear fighting in his day. But this is a modern theatre opened in 2008, mainly for amateur groups I think, and next door the Stratford Playhouse. So two institutions which just play into the theatrical reputation which Stratford has enjoyed certainly since Shakespeare's day, and most particularly since the late 19th century when the first Shakespeare Memorial Theatre was built. Keep going to Windsor Street, then right into Henley Street, which is the site of Shakespeare's birthplace, naturally the most visited of all the buildings connected to Shakespeare and his life in Stratford. Today it's a museum, and you can look round. You can also look at the statue outside of Shakespeare, and don't forget to cast your eyes left at the Public Library, another fine Elizabethan building, which has been very carefully restored. At the end of the road you'll come to a roundabout, and if you look at the corner where the High Street meets Bridge Street, you'll see a shop cum distillery, which is a building with a plaque on it because it was once the home of Shakespeare's daughter Judith and her husband, around whom there is quite a scandalous tale which I'll be recounting in the next episode. If you go down the High Street to the next corner where Sheep Street starts, then on that corner you will see the Town Hall, dating from 1767 and adorned by a large statue of Shakespeare in a niche up at the top, which was presented by David Garrick, the very famous actor, in the 1760s. On the corner where the High Street meets Ely Street is another glorious Elizabethan building with an interesting history, although this time not one linked to Shakespeare. It's called Harvard House, was built in 1596 by the grandfather of one John Harvard, who went on to become the founder of Harvard University in the States. It's now looked after by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust on their behalf, and sometimes there are visiting American scholars, and when they're in residence, the American flag flies outside. If you look up, you'll see the flagpole. Where the High Street meets Chapel Street, a fine Victorian building, now a bank, but worth looking at because it has a fine terracotta frieze all the way round it, depicting 15 scenes from different Shakespeare plays, and most appropriately for a bank, the central one over the entrance is a scene from The Merchant of Venice. Time to turn down into Sheep Street now, and you'll pass the Tudor World Museum on your left, and when you get to the T-junction you can cross the street and make slightly to your left over to the Gower Memorial at the far end of the canal basin. This large imposing statue was built in 1769. It was part of David Garrick's Jubilee Festival, which was held in honour of Shakespeare, and it's a statue of Shakespeare himself, surrounded by figures representing his work. So you've got Lady Macbeth representing tragedy, for instance, and Falstaff representing comedy, and I think it's Prince Hal representing the history plays. By this point you are practically where we started out, If you turn towards the theatre, you can walk along Bancroft Gardens to get back to it and enjoy what I might call tourist central really in Stratford. So lawns and a river view, yes, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre ahead of you, lots of ice creams and boats and that sort of thing. And on your way back to the theatre, you'll pass one last memorial, the Swan Fountain, a stainless steel sculpture of two swans about to take flight, which was erected in 1996 because that was the year when Stratford celebrated its 800th anniversary. But of course they chose something which gave a nod to Shakespeare too, because as you may well know, he used to refer to himself as the Swan of Avon. If, by the way, you like the idea of wandering round Stratford with a bit of a purpose, there are two suggestions I can offer you. From the tourist office, you can collect a leaflet called Stratford-Upon-Avon Riverside Heritage Trail, which is a walk a bit longer than the one I've described, which will take between 1.5 and 2 hours. And yes, take you past lots of Shakespeare things, but also take you past lots of places which pay tribute to Stratford's riverside heritage. A bit more of an in-depth look, if you like. Alternatively, you can find online, and I'll put the link in the notes, something called the Historic Spine Trail, which is a town centre walk devised by the Stratford Society, which tells the history of the town in notes and little maps and pictures, and which will take you past, and I'm quoting here from the leaflet, the finest of Stratford's buildings, ranging in date from the 14th to the 20th centuries. So either of those would be a good way to get to know this interesting little town. Normally at the end of the introduction I do a section called City of, which doesn't sound quite right for Stratford, so maybe just Town of. What? Well, it's very much Middle England. It's a town which represents Tudor England. It's a market town in a rural setting. It's a town whose emblems, I don't know about literally, but in my mind anyway, are the river and the swans and the half-timbered houses, all of which you'll see plenty of. It's the town of theatre, of course, from which sprang, am I allowed to be very English and say, the world's greatest ever playwright, in which you can see week after week some of the best performances of Shakespeare that you'll ever witness, although of course the Royal Shakespeare Theatre's programme every year does include some non-Shakespeare work as well. And so yes, to summarise in one word, Stratford-on-Avon really is the town of Shakespeare. So that's it for today then, an introduction to the whole thing. Just 2 episodes to come. This is a mini-series. And the next one I'm going to call Finding Shakespeare in Stratford-on-Avon. So a little bit of a biography, but stressing particularly the beginning and end of his life, which were the 2 periods he definitely spent mainly in Stratford. And visits too to all the various places connected with him which you can visit today. An idea of what you'll see in each of them, an explanation of why they're so important. Enough information, I hope, for you to be able to decide which ones you'd actually like to visit yourself. And then the 3rd and final episode, I think I'm going to call Theatre in Stratford. So again, a little bit of history, visits to the Royal Shakespeare Theatre for sure, and the town's other theatres, and 1 or 2 other places where you can learn about theatrical history here. Perhaps a few tales from theatre life too, stories of 1 or 2 actors and so on. So I hope that will make a nice little series and that you'll be happy to join me for the next 2 episodes. But meanwhile, for today, I just need to sign off and thank you very much for listening. Plus, of course, say goodbye. And I was rather keen to do that in Shakespearean language if I could manage it. So I did a bit of Googling and I came up with a couple of quite nice ways. Adieu and farewell. One that sounds a bit dismissive to me, go thy ways. And perhaps my favourite of the lot, goodbye then, rest ye merry.